Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Really excited to be partnering with the St. Louis Fed and the Aspen Institute on this topic. You know, the Federal Reserve does a survey of household economics and decision making, the SHED survey, and what we know over the about 10 years that's been done is that between something about 30, the last year I think it was about 32%, but it can be as high as 50% of the country is in a situation where they can't pay for an unexpected $400 expense. You know, one of the things that this organization is really tasked with, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's mission statement, people think of us in terms of executing monetary policy or supervising banks, but our mission statement is to foster an economy that works for all segments of society. And when you have numbers like 32 to 50% that are in that kind of precarious situation, we know we're not doing a good enough job on that score. So we're super excited that the St. Louis Fed and the Aspen Institute decided to pull together some of the best thinkers to bring this book together that's available to all of you here, and I'm sure we have a link to it on our website for those of you who are watching online. So we're super excited to have this group come together, and I'm going to hand the microphone over to my colleague Ray Bashara from St. Louis Fed, who will be the next to address you. But Ray, come on up.
Thank you so much, David. Welcome to all of you as well. I just wanted to add my thank you to David, Carmi, Deron, and the fabulous folks at the New York Fed who were eager to host an event. We thought it'd be last fall, ended up being now. Here we are. It's great to be here. First in-person book event that we've had, and really appreciate it. Also, a big shout out to my fabulous partners at the Aspen Institute, with whom I've been a senior fellow for many years and who we produced the book. And of course, Ida and I had the good fortune of editing the book. As David mentioned, you can get your book online. You can also get your free hard copy as well out there, but also you can order one online from the St. Louis Fed and we'll send it to you. So thank you all. That's all I wanted to say for now. Ida and I will join you at the end to offer a reflection. In the meantime, I'm eager to listen and learn. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, David. I'll do a very quick pile on. I'm Ida Rademacher. I lead the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute and also the enterprise-wide Partnership for an Inclusive Economy at Aspen. The whole issue of the future of wealth and the future of building wealth is different this time around. It's different because we have to hold ourselves to a level of ambition and accountability that we never have before. The stakes are high. One of the most interesting and exciting additions to how we think about the future of wealth is starting from a real granular understanding of the different experiences and drivers of debt in this country for different populations. So it is very exciting both to have been able to include that as a real essential element of the book, and all of the different people that are thinking about this issue and putting data behind this issue and solutions behind that issue, but especially to work with Devon and David and Ray and the teams to come together to put this together into an in-person and online engagement that really starts to go deep on that piece. So I want to also thank you all for being here. Thank you for engaging. It's just the start, and we look forward to hearing today. And I'll be in the front row clapping and cheering for everybody who made it in person, and everybody that's tuning in online. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. Let me go ahead and introduce Joanna Smith-Romani, who's the Managing Director at the Aspen Institute, who's going to lay some of the opening groundwork in terms of some of the contextualization of debt as an aspect of wealth and the future of wealth.
Thank you so much, Ida. What a gorgeous setting, and thank you for inviting us here. So as Ida mentioned, I am the we are now on my presentation. Okay, right, back to in-person things. I'm the Managing Director of the Financial Security Program, and I'm actually subbing in for a series of colleagues who were the original researchers for this, who couldn't be here for various reasons. But what I'm gonna do is talk about the intersection of wealth and debt and how deeply intertwined they are. It is important and really urgent that we understand that, because as this country has made lots of commitments around closing different wealth gaps, around more racial equity in wealth, around more inclusion in the financial system, We actually can't do that without taking debt very seriously. So I'm sort of hoping that we can dip debt in a little bit of chocolate and make it more appealing and more connected, and therefore more of a priority for all of us in the room, all of us online, all of the other folks in our networks, because that is really the only way that we're going to make progress on wealth in this country. So I'm definitely not going to read slides. How boring is that? Then you may as well be on a Zoom call. But I do want to read the one thing on the top of this, because this is what we all need to get, right? I think we do, but it cannot be overstated. No household achieves financial security without wealth. Wealth is essential. It is foundational. It is something every single person in this country needs. There's just no way around it. It can't be for some and not for all. The way that we have been describing wealth, really based on a bunch of consumer insights work, so working closely with families who are experiencing little wealth or no wealth, is that wealth really has 5 functions that they would like to see in their lives, and they are without them because of the absence of wealth. So resilience, investment in mobility, intergenerational support, of course, mental and physical well-being and quality of life. I see my colleague Signa Mary here, who's going to speak in a little, and we talk a lot about that together, and she sees it in her research. And super importantly, ownership, voice, and control over assets and institutions, and that's really how it relates to our democracy at large. The other way to think about it is to say net worth adds up to more than a number. Your wealth is more than just a number in your life. It is the sum of the material resources people have at their disposal to maintain financial stability, solve problems in their lives, take care of their loved ones, invest in their well-being, and pursue long-term goals. So it is everything. And in this country, we're all kind of exposed. We have to create the wealth on our own. We have to manage those predictable and unpredictable things ourselves. We need to support our families and loved ones in networks. And so we need actually a sizable amount of money to be able to do that, frankly, and to do that well. Sadly, why we're here today, work the Fed has done, St. Louis has done, Aspen has done, many of the academics and other researchers in the room have done, and know to be true, is we are just simply on the wrong wealth trajectory in this country. It has been since like the 1920s that we've had this level of wealth inequality in the US, and the recent economic trends just aren't giving me confidence that we're actually turning this around without, as Ida said, ambitious, significant, accountable sets of interventions, policy, product, market, government, all the things, everyone together to make a change on this. And there are major wealth gaps. We talk a lot about the racial wealth gap. That is real, persistent, ugly, frankly devastating in our country. There's also gender wealth gaps, there's geographic wealth gaps, and there's generational wealth gaps. And the last thing I'll say about this, if you look at that just truly traumatizing statistic about 80% of the population being essentially pretty poor wealth-wise, is that this is an everybody problem. This is not just, you know, a poor person problem or a black person problem or a woman problem. It's actually kind of all of us. You know, in 2008, I was saying this yesterday in a meeting, but when the foreclosure crisis hit, even if I was paying my mortgage and I was taking care of my house, it actually didn't matter if the rest of my street couldn't do it for themselves because of various reasons. It became my problem too, and this is really where we are today with wealth. So now I'm gonna share a little bit about death, oh my gosh. There is a connection between financial insecurity and mental health that does lead to suicide. That's true, we have a blog on it. That's not what I'm gonna talk about at the moment. My goodness, I'm gonna talk about debt. Because of the intersection, as I was saying, between wealth and debt. So this is some work that we did analysis on from the Survey of Consumer Finance that basically shows different wealth percentages and what the stack of debt is. Because what is in someone's stack matters really deeply to not just how debt is experienced by them, but to whether or not the debt is leveraging wealth or the debt is holding them back. So the stack matters a lot. If you look at the far left, you will not be surprised in the very low wealth category, that stack looks like credit card debt, lots of student loan debt, debt that I would call kind of getting by debt. And the high wealth side, on this right side here, it's mostly asset producing debt. It's mortgages, it's property debt, you know, it's things that relate to assets that are going to give them value over time. And, kind of the why do we have this debt, especially in the stacks that are in low wealth? There's just right now a real mismatch between income and cost of living. Basic expenses have gone up. You guys know this. We've read this. Housing. I can't say enough about dependent care and the way that impacts family financial security or household financial security, education, health, stagnating wages, no more stimulus checks. People have spent down their savings. So it's really, again, trajectory-wise, not looking good. But we can make some changes, and that's what today's conversation is about. As I said, how debt impacts you looks different depending on the stack. It also looks really different depending on your race and ethnicity. We do have a paper sitting outside, and for those of you online, it is on our website, aspenfsp.org, called Disparities in Debt, that goes much, much deeper and does the job that needs to be done around what it means to have debt in this country, depending on race. But just to show a couple of examples here, if you are a white family, you are more likely to have mortgage, rent, and other property, mortgage debt, and other property debt. You look a lot like the really wealthy families on the prior slide that wasn't divided by race. And if you are a Black household, you're more likely to have education loans. And the sad truth in our country is that student loan debt may turn into increased income for a household, but actually doesn't change into increased wealth for that household. So again, more in that paper. The other thing I want to point out is that, as I was saying before, half of the US, so again, this isn't just a one kind of person problem. Half of all of US households just don't have much debt. Wealth. Oh my gosh, listen to me, everyone. They don't have much wealth, they have a ton of debt. That's why we're here today. This is some analysis that we did, again, using the Survey of Consumer Finance to look at wealth holdings by deciles. And if we look at just the second, so the second least wealthy group in the country, they're looking at only $1,600 in assets, in some kind of wealth. That is like barely an emergency these days, barely. David mentioned $400. Now we see, regular occurring emergencies just costing so much more. If you look at the least wealthy households in the country, it's negative net worth. It's upwards of $18,000, again, as a median, a negative net worth. The typical household, until you get to like the sixth decile where you see retirement popping up, everyone kind of before it, on average, is just looking at for wealth assets, a transaction account, maybe a home, maybe a car, but those three kinds of things. Two of those require borrowing to get them, and one of them is depreciating. So it isn't exactly the right portfolio and mix that we can rely on to bring the kind of wealth that I was saying before every person needs to have to make sure to manage just life circumstances and have financial security. So I'm going to dig into that first decile for a moment. I just want to pause on it because negative net worth should be deeply troubling all of us. You can see here kind of how it's gone up during the Great Recession. For a long time, it was relatively stable. It was at or around this like 7%. But then during the Great Recession, it shot up. It came a little down, but we're still talking about 10-ish percentage, 11-ish percentage of households, 13 million people. That's a ton of people experiencing negative net worth. It's a persistent problem. It's one we don't actually know where it's going to go for all of the economic reasons that I mentioned to you before, but of course has enormous, if it's one thing if we're starting off from $1,600 and where do we go from here for wealth creation? It's a whole other thing if we're already, $20,000 in negative net worth at the median. Like, what are we going to do about the solutions for those folks? And it's a sizable population that can't be ignored. This slide makes me really sad because when you look at who has negative net worth, it follows other trends of who is already not doing well with financial stability and security in this country in ways that are not surprising, but should be alarming to all of us. Just a couple of kind of who's in this mix. Black families are significantly overrepresented in negative net worth, significantly. Student loan debt is primarily the driver in the data for increases in negative net worth. Over 70% of households who are in this whole bubble of negative net worth have student loan debt average $38,000. And the last point I'll say, which should also keep you up at night, again, I'm the up at night side of the conversation, but then I'm going to come back in a different hat and do panels on innovations and solutions. So I promise you we'll go to a different place with me. I don't always like to be the truth teller. But it is not a young people problem. So this isn't just because I'm early in my life, I'm 25, I graduated from college, I have student loan debt, I bought a home, and things are going to change. Half of this mess of people in negative net worth are actually over 35. So that means we have people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s who are looking at enormous amounts of negative net worth, and what does that mean for their real ability to have any kind of wealth in their life? The wealth that, again, is essential, fundamental, and not an option for all of us to have. So finally and briefly, because Raquana's told me I'm on my last slide, or that I need to have no more time, she says, I'll take 1 minute, is I just want to quickly get us back to where we began, which is that given the trends in household debt, what does that actually mean about getting millions of households into real, effective, durable wealth building opportunities? We created this model that starts with financial stability as a precondition. You need to have positive cash flow. You need to have little or no harmful debt as just a prerequisite for being able to amass investable sums of money, purchase or invest in an asset, and then protect your wealth. And there are, in fact, ways that debt throughout either anchor you, drag you, or leverage you and help you, right? So it isn't just that debt is a problem at the beginning. It is actually either a problem or a solution throughout. As I mentioned, we have a real portfolio of work that we've built on this. I'll just spotlight two. I already talked about disparities in debt, available to anyone who is here and online, to folks at our website. That gets very deep into debt being a driver of the racial wealth gap. We just released a paper, 101 Solutions for Inclusive Wealth Building. It's so exciting. 33 of those solutions are around debt. To get back to my point that these are intertwined, you can't choose one without the other. If you need your broccoli and chocolate, I've given it to you in this paper. But there's 10 related to cash flows, there's 14 related to asset purchases, 7 related to protecting and maintaining wealth, and 2 related to racial equity. So relevant to this conversation we're having today. And the final thing I want to say before I turn it over to May and her really exciting group of people to talk about this is just a lot of gratitude to my team who researched all of this, who can't be on stage right now. So Shariar Nabi is here, Catherine Lucas-McKay, Shada Elmi, Bianca Lopez, and Genevieve Melford, who are really the experts. Thank goodness we don't have time for questions, because you wouldn't want to ask me them. You'd want to ask those people those questions. And with that kind of sad tale of what is happening in our country, let me invite May and her discussion group up, because where they're going to go with it is, what does it mean? Data is just data. It's right and it's factual, but it's not human beings and it's not real life, and it doesn't say potential, and it doesn't say who people really are. So please come up, and we'll get the rest of the conversation going. Thank you.
My name is May Watson-Grote. I am the founder and CEO of an organization, a nonprofit called Change Machine, that builds financial security via a fintech platform for other practitioners and other nonprofits to help them embed financial security strategies into their own social service delivery models. And I am so grateful to be joined by Fred Weary, who is a professor of sociology at Princeton and the new Vice Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the founding director of Debt and Dignity, which is helping us all understand debt as unrelated to character, but instead much more closely affiliated with systems issues. He's also a friend and a board member, and I'm thrilled to be here with him today. My new friend is Lynette Colfani Cox. She is a writer, a blogger, a TV and media famous person.
Personality. Why
Personality,
not?
thank
Yes.
you. That's what I was actually searching for, thank you. She does coaching, she does teaching, everything from the nuts and bolts of these issues, like credit scores and debt repayment, all the way through the personal and emotional aspects of the work. And content-wise, how to get top dollar for your used car all the way to cryptocurrency, a huge breadth. And so she's also the author of numerous books, including the New York Times bestseller, Zero Debt, The Ultimate Guide to Financial Freedom, and the founder and president of The Money Coach. And so thank you so much for both being here with me today. So I'd like to skip the part about how harmful debt is. right? For one, Joanna just did it really so beautifully. The research is pretty stark and says a lot by itself. But I'd also like to challenge us. I'd like to challenge us. I'd like to challenge this room. I'd like to challenge the folks online to take really a page out of Andre Perry's scholarship, where lining up black and white data isn't nearly as helpful without the deep historical perspective that really just starts with how blacks were kept from home ownership, educational access, business obtainment, business development. And so instead, let's not maybe dwell so much on the well-documented deficits, and instead have our conversation really center Black people in the analysis. And so to kick us off, Lynette, if I could ask you, will you maybe refer, like thinking back to Joanna's presentation, I'd love to hear what resonated with you when you think about all of the professional work that you've done, what personally resonates with you?
Well, she highlighted so aptly a number of trends that we're seeing in terms of debt being able to either hurt or help people when it comes to achieving financial stability and wealth building. And I guess if you asked about my personal, what kind of resonated with me, the student loan issue, absolutely. I think some people who know my own personal backstory, you mentioned one of my 15 books is called Zero Debt, The Ultimate Guide to Financial Freedom. And I wrote that book after I got out of $100,000 in credit card debt alone. So people kind of know me for that. But I also had $40,000 in student loan debt when after I got my master's degree from USC. And that took me over a decade to pay off. And so certainly the personal knowledge of what it's like to be sort of held back by your debts, how it impacts your ability to save, to move forward, to reach financial goals, et cetera, is very much present for me. But then I think even beyond some of that, I think one thing that I'd kind of like the audience to know is the ways in which carrying debt, especially as an African American professional who's sort of first in a family to be first generation college, first to have achieved a certain level of success, first kind of generation to have grown in terms of having a business that's scaled as an entrepreneur, et cetera. It's very different for African Americans. It's very different. I think back to my own parents, for example, and my mom was a cashier and a clerk, and my dad was a shoeshine man in Harlem. His father was a shoeshine man, and his father was a shoeshine man. So 3 generations of Black men who absolutely did not have access to capital or to the types of financial solutions that would have lent them to wealth building. And so my trajectory has been one of going from debt to wealth, and in particular, using, frankly, debt in smart ways, particularly through real estate holdings. My husband and I own numerous properties, and seeing that debt is not evil necessarily, I think, because sometimes people make that assumption that, all debt is bad and all debt is evil, and that we really need to frame that conversation around, yes, there is an element of debt that can be harmful and prohibitive to your personal and financial goals, but at the same time, there are prudent ways to use debt. And so I'll just kind of wrap here by saying, about a year ago, I wrote about the so-called black tax and in Vox, and the ways in which people like myself, who are, again, kind of first in the families to have achieved, et cetera, and how the financial demands that are placed upon us to help other family members, et cetera, that in itself acts as a sort of a sap on wealth, especially when you look at multiple family members or multiple areas in a network that are under-resourced. And so where you have individuals essentially trying to fill in the gap and play the role that institutional systemic policy should be addressing, that's kind of like you're swimming uphill to do that. And it makes it hard to build generational wealth.
Yeah.
So not impossible, but absolutely more difficult.
Much more challenging.
Yeah, much of what you described about your own family background, it resonated with my own, although it's not parallel. So South Carolina, my parents owned their own home, and they did it because my dad said, I've known too many people who got loans from banks and had the properties taken away. And this was the 70s. And so what he and my mom did is they met this nice black lady who owned some land, and she said, I want to sell it to a black family. And it was out in the countryside. And they purchased it. And then they had to wait for a long time to then build their house. And how did they build their house? Because we had all these relatives who had worked as contractors building other people's houses, we simply contracted the relatives. And so it was a very sort of old school way of avoiding the banks. Although my dad would sort of always sing the praises of his credit union, he was not willing to sort of have that much control in someone else's hands. The other thing that's also a little different here, I think, between our stories is on the one hand, we sort of think about, people should plan better for retirement. And they actually had planned pretty well for retirement because he had a unionized job that had a pension. But once the company filed bankruptcy, that pension that was left was greatly reduced. And so everything they thought was coming in greatly reduced. And now my mother, who's widowed, she has a reduced pension. And so we just there's sort of the Bank of Fred, and then there are other family banks that we tap. And so the story of sort of black taxes is one that's a very important story. One of my colleagues, Rourke O'Brien, who teaches at Yale, sort of runs the numbers, and he basically tells a network story. And basically, the story is pretty straightforward. If you have more people in your network who sort of are going to need some assistance, and you are doing relatively well, then you're just going to have less money left over, the sort of disposable income that you can put towards investments. And so that's kind of how the tax works. But the other thing, too, that I think we sometimes forget is there's another kind of taxing that physically happens in these families when you're struggling and stressed about money. And so I remember going to see as one ages, one has to go see one's doctor. And they go through a whole list of everything that was wrong with your parents. And I'm like, my dad had 3 heart attacks. And my doctor told me to he said, just pause. How much do you run? What do you eat? What kinds of stressors do you have in your life? How are those different from the stressors that your father had? And so it was sort of one of those moments in which I started to realize that wealth protects. It physically protects us from a number of stressors. And so the kinds of cardiovascular challenges that my father faced, I don't have to face them. And it was one of those moments in which I really got to see how my sort of personal story and that private life was really, as the sociologist C. Wright Mills points out, tied to very public issues. So that really stayed with me.
I really appreciate both of your stories. Thank you so much. Let's turn to what our communities and our customers are saying. At Change Machine, from our perspective, the pandemic demonstrated kind of like a pushback on a common myth about the importance of financial literacy and financial education. That people aren't, and our belief is that the people aren't really struggling so much because of what they know or what tests they've passed or how they score on those various, back of the magazine kind of, quizzes, but they're struggling because of the systemic barriers, right, that keep people in too much debt and not enough wealth. And so practitioners in our network in particular, during the pandemic, saw a lot of like a temporary shift in the economic situation for a lot of Black families, and really demonstrating to us that indeed it's a myth, and that it's less about education and literacy and much more about assets and opportunity. Fred, I know that you recently, you and your colleagues recently published a piece in the New York Times, and so I'd love to hear about the myths you think there are around, particularly student loan debt.
Oh.
A lot.
Okay. So I guess one of the first things that comes to mind for me is thinking about the decision to enroll. And many of us sort of think about that decision to enroll in the way that maybe we experienced it. And so I remember sort of college time was a happy time, and you just sort of, you apply to things, and I had lots of fellowships that were offered, and so it was a very happy time. And for a lot of students, the decision to enroll is sometimes getting called every day by the college until they said yes. And so we're seeing some of this and some of what we're hearing from students. They were like, I wasn't sure, I was trying to do my research, but they really, I mean, they had a really strong push. The marketers were very good. Getting called every day.
It's called a funnel.
Yeah.
They probably put them in a funnel.
They put them in the funnel and they moved them along. And then one of the difficulties is that by the time that they, for those who actually, graduate, good for you, but often the return on investment isn't quite there. And so even if you're controlling for degree, and here we see sort of the racial wealth gap widening. Even when we're controlling for degree, you're going to be more likely to be underemployed if you're Black or Latinx. And so you start to see these gaps, and you did what you're supposed to do. It doesn't quite work out in the same way. You're still better off often if you're in the right school. If you're in the wrong school, then you're worse off, right? Because you're not getting the return on investment, and you feel trapped. And so one of the challenges too is if you have parents who are doing pretty well, who are that first generation of parents who are doing pretty well, there's a new challenge in that those parents they did not receive any wealth from their parents. They have very little wealth to push down to their own children, and so their children are going to be at higher levels of debt than comparable children whose parents are in similar occupations by race. And so there are all sorts of ways that you would think, oh, it should be fine because, and it's not fine. And I guess the last thing to point out is when we think about college going, the Pell Grant used to be twice what it is now, effectively. And this happened at the same time that you're seeing sort of reductions in how much state support goes towards public colleges and universities. And so as you see the expenses have gone way up, the support has gone way down, and there are all these other ways that the racial wealth gap sort of opens up. And the students, they feel trapped, and they feel as if they got promised a pathway to mobility that was just not going to have the same payoff for them as it does for others. And so I think that's been one of the very difficult parts of the story.
And that's particularly true for African Americans. I mean, if you look at some of the data around student loans for Black folks, it's very disheartening. We know that aspirationally, a lot of Black families, and certainly my family was one of them. I'm a Gen Xer, and my parents were like, go to me and my 5 sisters, you can do anything you want. Which college will you be attending? Not are you going to college, which college will you be attending? But we know that right now, with the $1.7 trillion in student loan debt that's outstanding, women hold about 2/3 of that debt. And Black people are in much worse position by and large after taking on student loan debt in so many ways. For the average Black woman who has gone to college and earned a degree, a decade after graduating, she actually owes more in student loans than she did when she first got out of school. And so yes, that whole idea of college being seen as this pathway to mobility, it doesn't always work out that way. And I don't think that it's only because of the school or where you went, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a whole bunch of things. The industries, of course, the chosen professions and things of that nature, the fact that we have pay gaps that are persistent. You know, we were talking earlier and I was saying that as a whole, it's not just about having a wealth gap, right? It's really that there are all these gaps. There's a pay gap initially. There's an access and an affordability gap when it comes to being able to enroll in college or to be able to access various products and services that are financial solutions that might help. There's a savings gap, right? There's a trust gap. And as your parents obviously clearly did not want to get a bank loan to build their house, they preferred to do it on their own. So there's this multiplicative effect that ultimately results in a wealth gap, again, driven by things like a home ownership gap, where you see only 43% roughly of African Americans own their own homes versus 73% of white Americans that are homeowners. So all of these gaps, they get exacerbated and multiplied over time. And then we start seeing all of this massive amounts of wealth inequality.
And let me just add, since we're talking about gaps, and they do exist, and they are important. But I like to say that everyone I talk to who's in one of the gaps, they will say, oh, I don't live in a gap. And so one of the challenges to this work is that the people that we're talking about, they don't want to be talked about as sort of in a hole or in a gap or anything else. And so one of the challenges is how do we both recognize inequality while sort of not sort of doing additional, forgive me for being a sociologist, symbolic violence, as we sort of think about sort of where people are positioned. And so this is always a challenge. I don't know that there's a great answer for it, but they will tell you, do not put me in a hole, do not put me in a gap. And they make decisions that will affirm for themselves that they're not in a hole and not in a gap, and sometimes they're very costly decisions. And so I'm sure that we'll talk more about this, but I always like to, when I hear gaps, I have to, I have to do my thing with symbolic violence, sorry.
The sociology thing.
Yes, my sociology thing.
Well, I think that's important because it's not only symbolic violence, there is economic violence that gets perpetrated upon communities. Yes. And so I think we have to actually recognize that and sort of, label it as such in a way that is not shameful, perhaps, or demeaning, or taking away from someone's dignity, right? But that recognizes that there is absolutely a problem here, and how do we best address that?
So to wrap up our panel, I'd love to turn to what does this mean for especially a lot of the folks in our audience, policymakers, researchers. And so instead of me asking you what you think the grand solution is, right? Because if I do that, it sets us up for some sort of like silver bullet answer, which we know there isn't one. And so instead, I'd love for you, if I could ask each of you, what do you feel like is the question that you want policymakers and researchers and industry leaders to ask themselves? And I'll give a quick illustrative example. I'm going to borrow from Angela Glover Blackwell's curb cut effect, in which she's observing that sidewalk indentations, right? They were first inspired for people in wheelchairs, but it has certainly helped folks with canes. It helps parents with baby strollers. It helps delivery people. It helps cyclists. And when we design our laws and our policies to benefit the most vulnerable groups that have been marginalized, such as people who are disabled or Black and brown women, we end up benefiting many more people. And so my question then is, what is the curb cut effect for debt? I would love to pose that to our audience as they think about their day-to-day work. So given all that you've described on this panel, I'd love to know what question, Lynette, if I can ask you first, what question you would pose for our audience?
I guess the main question I would pose is for innovators, for product solution providers, et cetera. Is what you're creating helping or hurting? And to what extent is it really rooted in financial inclusion as opposed to being something that is overtly or unintentionally exclusionary? So a couple of cases in point, and I see your 5-minute thing there for us. Let's say that an organization has designed a 401k plan for its employees to be able to save for retirement and to be able to build wealth for the future. The plan provider or sponsor, along with the employer, may say to the employees, here, if you contribute 6%, we'll give you a 3% match on that. So if you put in $5,000 in the year, we'll give you $2,500 in effect, right? Well, that's asking the participant to stretch, to put in that $5,000. Why wouldn't you design it to say, if you put in 3%, we'll give you a 3% an equal match? It's the same thing. We'll give you, if you put in $2,500, we'll give you $2,500. And that is more inclusionary in terms of getting people to be participating and to be able to save for their own retirement. Ditto for things like banking solutions where you start looking at monthly fees in checking accounts, for example. And it's well documented that in Black and brown communities, you have to maintain a higher balance just to avoid service charges. So why would it be any different in urban communities or in communities of color? Because what does that do? It leads to a whole bunch of knock-on effects. A person doesn't maintain a balance, they get hit with a $35 late fee, it might wind up on a checks systems or something like that, reporting. Ultimately, they may bounce other checks, they are behind financially, they have to use credit to pay. You know, paying that credit, they put more on their credit cards, they drive up their DTI or their debt to income ratio on their balances. Oh, they happen to be in the market looking for a mortgage. Now that credit score is lower. So it has this knock-on effect. And so I would ask for organizations to be really thoughtful and intentional and to really look at whether or not what you're doing is truly financially inclusionary or whether it's exclusionary and to what extent. And at the end of the day, I really do believe if you're not helping, you're hurting, you're adding to the problem.
And I guess what I would add here is thinking about the transaction context for a lot of these people, because when you go and you're trying to think about opening an account or engaging in investments, you're not just having that experience sort of out of nowhere. There's a backstory, a set of histories that informs what you're looking at, what your triggers are in the midst of those transactions, in the midst of those encounters. And so sometimes there may be, you may have a program, policy, product that looks pretty neutral, but it is not experienced as such. And when it is experienced as something that takes away control from the consumer, or that feels as if they're getting the finger wagged at them and they're grown adults, they will try to evade those product services contexts, and they will do it knowing that it comes at a cost. And so what I would sort of hope that we do is think very seriously about the functions of embarrassment and shame, the necessity for respect and dignity in our transaction context, and not only ask whether or not we were sort of innocently trying to design something that's neutral and good and maybe sort of looks optimal, but thinking about, are we experimenting and looking at whether or not, when put out into the world, consumers are experiencing it the way we think they're going to experience it. And if they're not, it's not their fault. It's not that they don't understand the product. It's that the product is not well designed for that particular population. And so that's my hope, that's the way we sort of turn things around going.
And if I could add just 10 seconds, you touched upon the finger wagging and the shame and blame. We know that absolutely does not work. The shame, the blame, all of that, it does not do anything to modify people's behaviors. Much better to get them to form appropriate behaviors earlier in life. But in general, those same organizations that are thinking about, designing products the right way, et cetera, it's not just about the structure of what you're offering. It's absolutely also about the customer experience. Because you can just Google banking while black, and you'll see a whole litany of instances where black people have been arrested, detained, questioned, et cetera, just for trying to cash a check. So they had a negative experience with a bank or with a financial institution, which led to distrust, which even if they did have the knowledge or access to a financial services provider, it would cause them to not engage because of those past negative experiences. So I would encourage people to really think about that and to really address any instances where you think that you're having an experience or your customer is having an experience in a way that is harmful and it is negative and is off-putting for them, to make them not want to engage with you as a provider or with the industry as a whole. There's a reason that a lot of people opt out, have made a conscientious decision to opt out of the traditional banking system. And I think this is what you're alluding to, Fred, that it's not like that they don't know, okay, if I go to an alternative services provider, a check cashing place, a payday lender, et cetera, they're doing that because they're like, at least I don't have to get the side eye when I walk into a bank, or have somebody look at me as if I don't belong there to be able to do a certain transaction.
Especially when you're well dressed and you still get it.
Well, we saw the guy from Black Panther, the director. He was one, and that really doesn't matter. So I see Wole has come here too. Hello.
Lynette, thank you.
Yes.
Fred, thank you so much. This was absolutely just very powerful, and I'm really appreciating all of your insights. I'd also like to just take a moment to thank my team, Shwanda Manuel Branham, Amina Kirk, and Arjun Kaushal, who put a lot of time and effort into getting us together to be able to have such a powerful conversation.
Yes.
So thank you both very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, May, Lynette, and Fred, for such a good conversation. Next, I'm going to invite up the next panelists for our Lifting Innovations panel, where we'll get to hear about some solutions.
Okay, you get another dose of me. And this was my original panel that I was supposed to be on. And I'm so excited to follow Fred and Lynette and May, because it puts so much meaning and actually a challenge, I think, to all of you out there creating products and influencing policy about, are we answering, what are the answers to the questions they just gave us so eloquently about what we're putting into the marketplace and into the world. Let me let my panelists quickly introduce themselves. This is not an investor pitch. So this is not even 60 seconds, but just the name and the company, because we're going to get into the innovations you guys are offering as we get into this conversation of, to May's really important point, there isn't a silver bullet, but what is it that we are going to do? You cannot listen to my very compelling presentation from earlier and not feel the urgent call to do something about it. And so that's what we're going to dig into today. So Brian, do you want to just quick introduce yourself?
I am Brian Young, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Home Lending Pal.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Sid Pila. I'm the founder and CEO of Sunny Day Fund.
Vishal Jain, I lead product development strategy for Prudential's financial wellness offering.
Super, well, great. So let's just get right into it. We have the questions that we were asked, challenged by the last panel, and I earlier presented a framework that said, here is a pathway to wealth and financial security in the country. I'm wondering just a quick round robin of reactions, things that surprised you, things you didn't know that you learned, ways you want to push back on me about my data, and then I'll call the 5 people that I told you guys actually did the analysis and ask them, share yours in the audience. But truly, like, first some reactions about what you heard, and then I want to transition into what is the particular piece that you are trying to solve with the work you're doing, because not everyone can solve everything, right? And part of our goal, if I'm just being real to the audience online and my audience here, is that we didn't just invite you because you were really thoughtful, smart, interesting people to talk with, and we've all been holed up in our homes for 2 years, which makes us all even more interesting, but also because we have to do something about it, and this is a real invitation for everyone to figure out which part of those 5 in the model I shared, the 5 pieces you want to tackle, where do you fit in, and what can you do about it? So let me start with you, Vishal, like just reactions to what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I think for me, I think in the data you presented, the sort of starkness of the divide between the top, well, for lack of a better word, the top 20% and then the next 60, that was surprising. I didn't think it's that steep of a drop off, if you will, in terms of wealth and debt. And I think it really does demonstrate that as we think about the solutions we'll talk about here, I mean, it's really not just, it's very widely applicable, right? Everything that we're talking about. And even I think when you look at that 20%, even there, I think there's a lot of variation. And I think I think there was a New York Times or Wall Street Journal article recently that 250K income families are living paycheck to paycheck, right? So I think you have a lot of dispersion there as well. So our at Prudential, I mean, we've been providing important products for financial security for over 100 years, right? Life insurance, investments, annuities. But what we've built on that over the last 6-7 years is recognizing that, for instance, 10 years ago, we had no solutions to help people specifically with debt.
Right.
Our advisors might give you some good guidance, some good suggestions, but we didn't have solutions on that. And we saw an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to continue to offer our core products, but let's start to wrap those products with a set of complementary services that really help people holistically, right? Because if someone's drowning in debt, they can't invest in our retirement products. They don't have the ability to do that, right? Because that's really the core issue they've got to get past.
Yeah, your market is shrinking. When the country looks like this, where is your market for the retirement products, honestly?
We can't serve those individuals and families. And so what we've been doing over the last 6-7 years is building out a suite of financial wellness capabilities that get at people's more holistic issues, right? Debt management, budgeting, caregiving, et cetera. Yeah. And so today now, and we do a lot of this through partnership. We're not the experts in everything, but today we have capabilities to help people optimize if they've got a portfolio of student loans using the federal loan programs. We have capabilities to help people, with credit counseling, with restructuring their debt if needed. We just rolled out a service to help counsel people if they're looking to buy a home and figure out, what's affordable, should you think about mortgages and things like that. And we're doing those things because our clients, we work with employers, we work with associations. They want to help their employees or members become more financially healthy. They've recognized that it's not enough just to offer a 401k plan. You've got to help people holistically, and so we want to help those organizations help their constituencies and get at the root causes of what is someone's fundamental barrier to kind of taking the next step to achieving financial security.
Well, you guys sat in the order that I would have imagined we would have spoken, so this is really perfect because you touched on, you're trying to solve some of the, with the exception of the home buying advice, kind of the debt that may be holding people back. Like, where can we round out our services and products to help with kind of that debt I was describing that might be an anchor, not a catapult, as my colleague Ida likes to say. And so, Sid, you're doing it in a different way around savings, but how do we even get around needing some of that debt? So one, reactions to what you've heard, shocking, surprising, confirming, and then a little bit of which part of this challenge you're trying to take on.
Absolutely. So my reactions, I thoroughly enjoyed the data as an engineer, so thank you for sharing that. And the scary part is that's 3 years old.
Yeah.
So the picture has gotten worse, everyone. And specifically on the debt side, that debt does not include all the buy now, pay later, all those different type of products that have proliferated over the course of the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Or the fact that, we've had a pandemic. So that's the biggest thing. I'm really excited for the next survey of consumer finances, if we can say that. The second piece is Lynette and Fred, thank you for sharing your stories, because everything that you just said about financial inclusion, equity, making sure that we're designing a customer experience around the individual and the process they go through when they open a bank account, for example. I totally understand that, and I appreciate that, because that's where we start. We start with understanding that at the end of the day, it's really costly for people to even start saving, because as soon as people make the decision, let's not even forget that there's a lot of things that happen before making the decision.
Right.
But when people decide to start saving, it's still a pretty big barrier to banking, to earning a meaningful return on those savings. I recognize that we're at the Fed Reserve. Let's all take a moment to realize that over the course of the last 2 decades, we have not had an economic incentive to save other than pure fear. So we need to figure out, from an inclusion perspective, how do we restore that economic incentive in a way that employees, whether they're Black, brown, women, immigrants, and I'm an immigrant, so that's the most relevant background that I bring to this.
Yeah.
We are focused on making sure that those types of employees, as they aspire to retire one day, can start with enough savings on hand. And we also leverage the employer in that process, because as you've seen, again, over the course of the last year, employers are starting to realize that their employees are the source of their growth. Their employees are the engine. So that's what we're doing from a technology perspective, really sitting in between the world of banking, the payroll technology, and the individual employees.
Super, that's great. And then Brian, you're one again, want your reactions, but you come on, if I'm thinking about the model I had around, you have financial stability, you've moved on to amassing some savings through SID, you've managed your debt through Vishal, and now we're at a place where we might be able to actually get our first real big asset, right? And can you talk a little bit about, again, your reactions and what you're doing to try to solve the problem?
No, I think the data was confirming, although scary, it definitely confirms what we thought. And Lynette and Fred, I think you guys hit on the biggest point out of all of this, is that we don't consider the gaps. And to put that into perspective, we are a venture-backed startup. We raised $2 million, and I couldn't even get a $50,000 line of credit. But that was never actually an application. So that even that type of data isn't reported.
Yeah.
So what our solution, or what we're trying to build, is this artificial intelligence that, going back to the gaps again, being in a Black household, it can be very embarrassing to talk anything about finance. We don't have conversations about credit. We don't have conversations about income and things like that. If you're lucky, some of your parents might have that, but in many cases, you are the first. You're the first to go to college. You're the first to get a good job. You're the first to do this. And those conversations can be very hard and difficult to have. And so, I believe that in this perfect world, we can mix artificial intelligence and humans together to make those conversations a little bit easier. Even in scenarios where I am unsure what to do next, if you can have this system that says, okay, well, the Sunny Day Fund, and reward the users for practicing better financial habits that will ultimately lead to home ownership. That is really kind of our goal, and is to build this help network that brings all these opportunities in, so that whether I feel like I'm comfortable going and talking to a human or going to talk to my parents, I can still talk to artificial intelligence, and it will help me find those options for myself to build wealth in our community.
Sid, tell me a little bit about, are you seeing success? Like, what would you describe as impact so far? Or where are you hoping to head for impact with what you're doing? Anything you can share about kind of where we are in the arc of the life of this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So our organization is in the world of tech, we call it in production. So thankfully, we've seen some incredibly meaningful statistics coming out of it. Folks that are earning $15 to $23 an hour are putting away over $1,000 per year into their emergency savings, but not just emergency savings. They're aspiring to put down a security deposit, put down a down payment into a home, because at the end of the day, that's a very important part of the wealth building process. Buy a car, though I will say that fuel prices may be a deterrent there right now. And more so than that, one of the things that we've seen is that we've really helped bridge the intent action gap. And the way that we have done that is through the employer-sponsored rewards, right? So everyone wants to save, right? If you ask the question, do you want the ability to put money away out of your paycheck? Everyone says, yeah, of course I want to do it. But then when you actually try to action that behavior, They have to go to a bank account. They get shamed at that time. There are restrictions on the minimums and everything. What we've been able to do is get 50, 65, 70% of voluntary participation into a benefit like ours, which is substantial, right? So now, all of a sudden, it's not just people wanting to do it, they're actually doing it. So that's how we've been helping. And in terms of the bigger picture, one of the other pieces that I always like to say is, there's 152 million American workers, right? When we think about the number of folks that are participating in retirement savings and the number of folks that don't have enough in emergency savings, it's over 100 million people, y'all. This is a big number. So yes, we're starting with a few set of companies, but we have a massive way to go. And I would highly encourage everyone to think about this as a part of their portfolio.
Michelle, thank you. That's really exciting. I'm wondering what you know about where, especially on the debt side of your offerings, like, have there been incentives? I keep thinking about this question of incentives and why are people doing it and how you make it easier, but how you don't take away all the control from the choices you make to do the thing. How is that balanced in how you work with employers on the products? And in normal life, not in my work life, it's really hard for people to say, I need help about my money. So I'm wondering, are they more or less likely to be, like, what's the experience about saying in my job, well, then I actually really do need help, so I'll get it here?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I would say the first place I would start is, I think in the last 5-6 years, financial wellness has become a core part of most employers' total wellness strategies.
Okay.
That was not the case, 5-10 years ago, because employers have realized that the biggest source of stress for their employees is financial stress.
Right.
So, I think, eBree had a stat recently. I think, 90% of employers are developing or have developed a financial health strategy, but the majority are actually expanding what they're doing in the wake of the pandemic. So I think you've got good employer buy-in, right?
Okay.
I think the second piece is, study after study generally shows employees view their employers as a trusted source, right? They are looking for their employers to help them, more broadly and more deeply than they have in the past. So I think you have receptivity from that standpoint. And then the third thing is, I think, with there's a lot of great debt nonprofits that can help people with debt. I mean, they're actually probably underutilized.
Yeah, most certainly.
And because either people don't know about them, or maybe there's, as you mentioned, maybe a hesitancy about it. And I think one of the nice things about doing things in the workplace is you can actually engage individuals, right? You can communicate through the employer channels. You can potentially communicate at life events if you know someone's going through something, right?
That's true.
And so I think it gives you more ways to kind of bring these services to people, to promote them. But I would say we are in the early innings. I think when I think about overall this, what we're doing in financial wellness, I think our biggest opportunity over the next few years is really how do we drive more engagement and more awareness of capabilities. Some of it's people just don't know how they can be helped. Some of it sometimes is a barrier, but I do think the employer, doing it through employers as one place is a place to kind of reach more people and reach them more scalably. And you're doing it in an environment where I think employees are kind of primed, if you will, to look for solutions because they trust what their employers done for them.
That's such an interesting point. Like thinking about our great HR team at Aspen, they do know when something's going on in my life because I've probably had to reach out to them for various and sundry reasons. And can they be fluent enough, good salespeople
to
enough
refer you? Hey, here's something I can help you.
To do good referral. I have a question for you, Brian, but you just made me think of a question, Vishal, for you and Sid, which is, like, what? You can think about how to say this in the least crass way. Do you think that employers? What is their incentive? Let me say it this way. Like, do they expect you to be able to numerically show some sort of like ROI on productivity, on employee retention, on so-and-so? Or do you think the experience of the pandemic has changed where they know that it's needed and they think that's just costs they have to put out, sort of like medical insurance, right? They don't need to know how much I used it to still offer it. I'm curious how maybe that's changing or not, because I remember the early days, it was like you had to convince the employer that this would retain employees and they wouldn't have to pay for training again. And it's hard to show that and it am I wrong? but like truth talk, right? But it's important and it may not show in short terms, financial gains or stability gains, but it matters. So and I'm just curious where employers are at with those decisions.
Well, I'll just answer real quick and then pass it over. But yeah, I think employers are looking for three things. I think one is they want to see engagement with the financial health services they're rolling out.
Okay.
Are people using them?
They want to see numbers.
They want to see that people are using them, right? I think second, then they'd like to see, okay, are employees taking financial actions, right? Are they saving more in the retirement plan? Are they electing more voluntary life insurance coverage if they need it, right? Is it translating that? And then the third piece, I think, which is going, okay, well, is that translating into productivity, lower healthcare costs? There is some complexity in the data analytics to figure that out, and some employers embark on that journey. Others kind of, I think, look at industry stats and kind of view it as, okay, if I'm doing these things, it has an impact. Or they just look at the overall trending, right? What's happening in my overall trending on healthcare costs, on absenteeism, and then viewing financial wellness is one of the things that gets them there.
Okay.
At Prudential, we've done that correlation. You know, we've looked at our employees and we saw that we lowered financial stress by more than 50% over 10 years. And we did the back end data correlation to say, okay, that was, you know, the individuals who had lower financial stress had lower healthcare costs. But it depends on the employer if they, you know, they're going to invest in kind of that level of analytics to be able to show those correlations.
Yeah. Sid, how do you see that in kind of you're getting your product out to employer partnerships?
Yes, absolutely. And we have to make that as a part of the case, especially because with Sunny Day Fund, it's so new, right?
Yeah.
This is something that has not been an employee benefit. So much like what Vishal said, everything he said is true. Retention is a big part of the selling. So what we do and what we've been grateful for is that we've seen that in the participants of Sunny Day Fund, we've seen 25% higher retention rate. And that's an employer voluntarily sharing that data back with us for us to be able to reflect that back. We also are seeing that employers in general, yes, they want the ROI, but the folks that are innovators in their own right, they're starting to realize that it's more than just ROI from a numbers perspective.
Right.
It's also a diversity, equity, and inclusion related strategy. So Lynette, you shared, for example, earlier about the way that a 401k plan is structured. One of the places that I thought you would go with it is that when you're looking at the 401k loans, which is another form of debt, as it turns out, you are looking at withdrawals and loans, you're seeing that Black households have 3 times as much as their white peers. Hispanic individuals have twice as much as their white peers. So these are all interrelated numbers and interrelated strategies. So when we are convincing employers that they need to move on the things that they're promising everyone in words, we can show them that data.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Brian, you are not through employers.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are you doing? We're only supposed to go through employers. No, with all seriousness, it is good to know what the other channels are. Are you seeing success? How hard is it? Like, how? Because you're early enough on. Maybe we're not seeing huge impact numbers yet. I don't want to be inaccurate. You tell us.
We're still early.
You're still early,
We had about 20, well, a little bit between 20 and 25,000 users right now. But it was only in a 2-month period, so we showed
actually
quick
seems
scale.
pretty big.
But the thing with lenders is that they are very profit driven. So you have a lot of lenders that will make public proclamations about doing more to address the gaps, but then behind the scenes, it's usually driven behind the numbers. Oh, well, show us some, and then we'll do a little bit more for you. And so, it took us a year to really get over that hump, basically. And to Fred's point earlier, a lot of it is just you have to understand that the solutions that we're building are not necessarily problems that you see and you and your family see. So that doesn't mean they're not problems altogether. And so there's a lot of education around just that aspect of it. And to your point earlier, I think the most beautiful thing you said is that it's not just a Black problem. Like, yes, Black people are impacted the most by it, but it's really an everyone problem. Like when we look at millennials and Generation Z, they're not as financially savvy as baby boomers. But yet they don't want human interaction. They prefer a digital first experience. And for the most part, they do everything on their cell phones. So we can't try to keep fitting them into this old box and expect a different outcome. Like, we are in a very dangerous place right now.
Let me ask you guys, so you're doing the solutions you're doing, but you're seeing, because you're interacting with consumer data and consumer stories and with the employers you work with, other things that are going on in people's lives. Like if you weren't, deeply in the companies you're in and no one's asking you to leave them, please let everyone know that. I'm not asking, I don't want anyone at Prudential to be like, why'd you offer Vishal a chance to leave? I'm not doing that. But what is the innovation you think is needed next? I'm gonna ask you both for policy and for market, like where do you need policy change? But I'm curious first, like you're doing these products, it doesn't have to be something Prudential will even bring on or that Sunny Day Fund would expand to, but you're seeing things, right? Like, you're seeing red flags that are coming that I don't get to see yet because I'm not in consumer data all the time and hearing calls from customer support. So what is it that you're seeing? And again, I'm asking to be explicit to this crowd in here and online, because you should do something about these things, right? We all have to do a piece of this, and not everyone has to do the same thing. Well, I want you to inspire our audience about a challenge that is solvable with creativity and grit and caring and a set of values, to go back to what Lynette and Fred challenged us on around why are you doing this? For whom does it benefit? So I don't know who wants to go first, but I'm really curious what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing that really, it's more of from a positive side, I think is a lot of innovation in helping consumers navigate specific life events.
Okay.
Right, so not everyone has a financial advisor, right? I mean, some of those who do, you can call up an advisor sometimes, hey, I'm about to buy a home or about to do this, can you help me think about this? But for the rest of the consumers who don't have a financial advisor, I think where you're seeing interesting innovation, particularly in the fintech space, is fintech saying, okay, I'm going to take becoming a new parent, right? And okay, what are all the critical financial decisions that happen during that life event? How do I then bring guidance and use technology to bring data to help people think about, well, what are the implications of different choices? And then how do I bring relevant product solutions? Maybe somebody needs help with paying for childcare, et cetera, right? And so I think that's interesting, because I think it's saying, look, you don't have to become an expert in all financial topics.
Right.
You don't have to have a financial advisor all the time, but you're going through the specific life event, and through the use of technology and data and other capabilities, I can try to help you navigate it to create the best long-term outcome.
Based on where you are in your life cycle.
Based on where you are, right?
Very cool.
Not just getting you the product you need or the transaction,
Right.
but helping you optimize that decision. And so a number of fintechs that we meet, Brian's company, I think in the home purchase process, others, seem to be focusing on that, and that's interesting. I mean, at Prudential, we view that as an opportunity to partner with those kinds of organizations, bring that type of capability to our clients. We're also building some of our own, around some of the life events that are important to our clients. But I think that's an interesting dynamic, and I think it has the promise of creating scalable impact.
Yeah.
Right, because
totally.
we know that people, if you navigate these key life events, it can have positive or negative impact for decades.
Yes. And it's too much to take it all in at once, truthfully, right? Who has their next idea? I don't need to choose. All right, Brian, you go, so we aren't just doing a line.
I think a lot of it is lowering the barrier for tech phobia with government agencies. We have a lot of 20th century policies that are trying to regulate 21st century technology. And what I mean by that is, particularly within the mortgage space, we have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which was intended to basically make the playing field equal. But what we have seen with that is that, one, it's an optional option for lenders. And since the CFPB has raised the closed loan amount from 25 to 100 loans over the last year, we've seen actually an 18% decrease in the number of lenders that are actually reporting HMDA data.
Interesting.
And
Which to translate means we don't actually know.
You don't actually know
what the lending by race is.
And even on top of that, before the lenders are submitting to the CFPB, they do have the ability to edit the data first. So even beyond that, it's like there's two issues there that we are not really addressing.
We don't even know if we can trust the data, basically.
Exactly. Can we truly trust the data? So, even though, and I mentioned blockchain, this is all I'm going to say about blockchain. We're not focused on cryptocurrency. Our focus is on, not yet, right? Our focus
That'll be
is
next
more
month
on,
back at the Fed.
Going back to, I'll come back to New York.
I know you will.
Our focus is more on going back to the original core of blockchain as a document management repository, because it creates this immutable ledger where we can then see what's going on. So now when you have bigger companies like, and unfortunately I hate to pick on Wells Fargo, but we're talking to them because of this reason.
Yeah.
When you have these bigger companies that are fined for discrimination, and they pay this $250 million fine, and then they go on about their day, like, did they really change what they were fined for? We don't know, but if we have them on blockchain, at least we can see with this immutable ledger if they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. So I think government policies have to be intentional in allowing technology to at least the opportunity for us to explore the possibilities of what could be.
Very cool. Sid, what would you like to offer to the group as inspirational ideas?
I think that both of the ideas are just offer great, and I'm just going to expand on them from our side. Look, I think that wealth is just one of the biggest assets that we can have when we are pursuing happiness, because that's what we're here for, right? At the end of the day, the goal is happiness. It's not wealth. It's just one of the biggest
Yeah.
assets along the way to happiness. And when you structure it across the different goals that people have for themselves that have different price tags associated with it, and insert solutions like what Prudential is offering and what Home Lending Pal is offering and what Sunny Day Fund has, that is the journey that people will be able to take, and they see that as a clear path. And I think that having that as a holistic journey, whether that is leveraging the employer as a channel or maybe starting even earlier with some of the things that we have talked about, previously, like baby bonds, then that's another opportunity. I think I totally agree with Brian. I think there's so much opportunity to modernize our policy and not try to fit new solutions into old buckets. For example, I am very thrilled that Senators Young and Booker are talking about Emergency Savings Act of 2022. And I'm glad that this is coming up as a part of the Secure Act 2.0. However, we're trying to stuff that into the entire world of retirement savings. The user experience, coming back to what Fred was saying earlier, of an employee that has a life event and that needs to take money out, is very different from liquidating assets in a 401k or 403b. And at the end of the day, we are trying to create a world that enables more people to come into the world of banking, more people to come into the world of financial services. And so as we're crafting new policies with the positive intentions, I just want to raise the bar for us to make sure that we're doing it with the user in mind in the first place.
Yeah, we're going back to the original questions that will be with us through the day and hopefully into what we do with our work that Lynette and Fred gave us. Thank you. I mean, my goodness, the future is bright with innovators like these guys. I really appreciate the conversation. A couple quick things before we go on a short break. One, I think we all have different challenges to take to ourselves. Our policymaker friends on the call, on the video, or with us here, our advocates, our policy crafters, our business leaders, kind of all of us. Thank you for those ideas. We have the questions that we should be challenging ourselves. And our next panel, so we're gonna let everyone take a break because, as David said in the beginning, we're not allowed to eat or drink in this room. I, for one, am deeply thirsty because you have seen too much of me, so I need water. Folks online will be back in a moment, so you also go get a drink of water or a Diet Coke. But you have to come back, because generally with these kinds of conversations, we end here. There are so many good ideas. You guys are so smart. Thank you for bringing these innovations to the world. But we don't actually get to the hard questions of, to make those innovations get in the world, you have to fund them. You have to invest in them. You need government policy and resources. You need private sector money and resources. You need philanthropic dollars. You need investment capital. All the things these guys know. And so we actually have to talk about that, or we will make no progress on these real big issues. So that's our next panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking around, and thank you to everybody who's watching online. So this is a forward-looking panel that showcases how different organizations, be they policy, philanthropy, impact investors, mission-driven, venture capital, can bring capital to debt solutions. We are looking at different products in the market, as we've discussed today, and we want to understand what it would take for today's conversations to come to fruition from a capital standpoint. So we have a distinguished panel here with us today, so why don't I let them introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Willie, do you want to get started?
Sure, great, thank you. So my name is Willie Coxson. I'm the president and CEO and founder of a company called Mobility Capital Finance, which we affectionately call MoCaFi. I spent 20 years in financial services, big companies. Had sort of my George Floyd moment after the death of Michael Brown, realizing that traditional institutions are not serving what I'll call the bottom third of the pyramid in this country. There's a systematic issue, and we need new models to sort of address that. So I've started a company that puts people on a path from instability to stability to thriving using digital solutions. So excited to be here, and it's a privilege to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Morgenstern. I'm an investor with Flourish Ventures. Flourish is a global early-stage venture capital fund. We focus on innovations that advance financial health, both for individuals and for small businesses. It's a $500 million vehicle. Piero Midiar, who is the founder of eBay, he's our sole backer. And we have a portfolio of 70 fintech companies around the globe that span the full gamut of financial service products. from mobile banking to personal finance, debt management, as well as insurance and back-end infrastructure. And we also partner with industry thought leaders. So folks like the Financial Health Network, the Aspen Institute, FinReg Lab, and the work that they're doing around policy and research initiatives that foster an inclusive and fair financial services system. So excited to be here with this group. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
So Don Baylor Jr., Managing Director of Services and Head of Worker Solutions at Lafayette Square. Lafayette Square is an impact investing management platform that seeks to deploy capital and curate services to improve economic mobility and economic opportunity. As a private credit institution, we seek to use that platform to deliver results around financial security, including reduced household debt. And so for most of my career, I've utilized philanthropic capital to improve financial security and reduce debt, and now using private capital as a platform to reduce household debt.
Terrific. Signa Mary?
I'm Signa Mary McKernan. I'm an economist at the Urban Institute. I'm also a vice president there. And just my dissertation was on access to credit. We were just talking about that. So, credit is a good word, right? Debt is a bad word. Debt's bad. It's same thing. But just over the past couple decades studying wealth building and how to build wealth, and really excited today to talk solutions and how to get funding for those solutions.
Great. And I'm Jonathan Cavell. I work here in the Community Development Group at the New York Fed. So, Signa Mary, why don't we start with you from the perspective of the role of government and policy, and some thoughts on this panel and the things you've been hearing today.
I just want to first say thank you to the bank for hosting us here today, and to Ray Boshara and Ida Rademacher for their powerful book. Kilolo Kijakazi and I co-authored an essay in the book, and what we know is that after a half a century, the racial wealth gap remains wide, and that we really need bold solutions to solve it. So that's on page 45 of your book. We're providing some of that demonstration of that evidence. So we need those bold responses. How do we make them happen? Funding plays a key role in this ecosystem and is needed to bring them about. And so when I think about that, I'm going to start with first resources for research, right? We need to start with evidence on the problem. In 2019, the typical white family had 8 times the wealth of the typical black family. And despite some fluctuation over the past few decades, this ratio disparity was as high in 2019 as it was in 1983 for the typical black family. And if we go all the way back to 1963, as Kilolo and I did in our essay, we see that over the last half a century, the dollar amount of the racial wealth gap has grown substantially. So funding research about identifying and writing about that problem is important. And then I think even more important is research on the root causes of that problem. That's so important because if we're going to do solutions to address it, we want to get at those root causes. And some people assume that these wealth inequities are the result of individual failures, or people not making the right decisions, or a lack of personal effort. Oh, if they just would get an education, if they would just get some financial literacy. But we know that these origins in wealth and inequality, there's been a lot of historical research, there's been a lot of analysis, that they lie in the policies, the programs, and the institutional practices that helped create pathways for white families to build wealth while setting up barriers for black families to build wealth. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm excited to work at Urban Institute is because it's on changing some of those policies and those pathways. So many wealth building programs exist. And if you look at Aspen Institute, they've provided 101 of them to get you just started in your thinking. So there's a lot of different ways to go. And as you think about them, I recommend considering which ones are large enough to make a substantial difference. Because as I just said, the racial wealth gap is very large, far larger than any income gaps. And so I'm going to talk about 3 buckets of solutions, and I'm going to use them as examples of the types of resources that are needed to bring evidence on them, to pilot them, to evaluate them and to scale them. So to address wealth disparities, scholars, none more prominently than Professor Derek Hamilton, have talked about baby bonds or baby trusts. I think Sid mentioned them earlier too. So this is a birthright to capital. We're talking about where do you get the capital to start those small businesses we heard about before? Where do you get the capital to pay for that down payment on a home, or to pay for that education so you're not ending up with student loan debt? And so that is what baby bonds or baby trusts would be, this birthright to capital for home ownership, small business, or education. Baby trusts do not emphasize personal savings because it wasn't personal savings that created the racial wealth gap. So it's not about individual savings behavior. And then for children born into low wealth families, they should be large enough so that with compounding interest, when that young person becomes an adult, it's enough money for that down payment to start that business or for that education. And Professor Zood simulated that universal baby bond program would narrow wealth inequalities by over 90% while improving the position of young adults. So we have that initial evidence there, and that was necessary for research and for the idea. And then the next step with baby bonds is really the resources to pilot and to evaluate them. Government is stepping in with some of those resources. Connecticut and DC passed the first baby bonds legislation in the country. Stephen Brown and I testified before the DC Council on them. And American Opportunity Acts have been proposed in the Senate, sending baby bonds potentially up for national scale. So that's one example of a big, bold solution. If I go to another bucket, it would be matched or incentivized savings accounts. And these are a predecessor to baby bonds and still very important. They also provide capital for home ownership, business ownership, education, and retirement. But a key difference is that they require individuals to save, and then those savings are matched, like we heard about. You put in, and we'll match that amount. And these you have to be really careful with because they can end up being regressive. Because who can benefit more from that match, right? It's going to be people with more incomes who can save more and get that match. So these are a little bit further along in evidence. We have randomized control trial, which is the gold standard of evidence about their efficacy. They include child savings accounts, individual development accounts, earn to learn programs, and then also retirement accounts. And here I want to recognize or acknowledge Michael Sheridan, who for the idea and for piloting a lot of them originally, and then Ray Boshara and many others for helping to bring them to scale through the Federal Assets for Independence legislation and program that helped them come successfully to national scale. So as I said, they're more advanced than baby bonds in terms of evidence, and that means that that's because funding was included as they were being scaled for that evaluation. So we've learned a lot that can now be applied to future wealth building solutions. Automatic enrollment's key. We need seed deposits. You need people in households with lower wealth to get larger seed deposits, or it's going to be regressive. We need to exclude capital from asset limits. Some of the innovative pilots out there combine elements of these. I'm thinking about Rooted, a new wealth building pilot that's really exciting in St. Louis, Missouri, where they're going into a few neighborhoods that are at risk of gentrification. And some of those households will get $20,000. They don't have to, they're getting it now as adults to be used for, again, small business, home ownership, investment accounts. And the idea is that that money then might keep those people from being displaced as their neighborhood gentrifies, so that they can stay and be wealth building in it. And then just one last policy that I'll mention that doesn't require any capital, and that is easing savings penalties from asset limits. That's a policy that doesn't require capital, and it can actually save the government administrative costs because they cause people to churn on and off federal programs, costing more administrative costs.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about what's working well. Sarah, could you maybe give some examples of things that you've seen and investments that you've made and things in the portfolio that are really good examples of things that are working well?
Yeah, so maybe first just a preface on sort of market-led innovation generally as applied to this problem. I think the last panel, Brian and Sid and Vishal beautifully illustrated and brought to life for us that there is a meaningful place for tech-led innovation in reaching more people at lower cost with better financial products. That said, innovation is neither good nor bad, right? And so I think as investors, we need to be really thoughtful about the broader guardrails and how we're evaluating the potential for whether a product is likely to be inclusive or not. And this is sort of in response to the call to action, which I thought was so powerful from our first panel. So we have a set of what we call fair finance principles, and it's essentially just questions we ask ourselves each time we're making an investment around, is this doing right by the consumer? Are there the right set of consumers here, or sort of incentives? And how is data being used? And then the third is just to say, tech-led innovation is not a panacea. I think it can be easy when we have panels like this to sort of give the 6 examples of stuff that is really exciting, but it needs to be paired in concert with upgrades to our public digital infrastructure, with policy reforms, and with addressing holes in our social safety net. And so I don't do that to sort of poo-poo the role of market-led innovation, but I think we need to put it in its proper place in terms of the broader solution set. So that said,
appreciate it.
If I put on my investor hat, here's what I see, right? I see 2/3 of Americans that are struggling with financial health, stark disparities based on race. I see them spending more than $300 billion a year in interest and fees, right? It is the old adage of it's expensive to be poor. And I look at the possibility of leveraging smartphone technology, AI, big data, behavioral finance, smart automation to deliver better products at lower costs, right? The market opportunity is there through the eyes of investors. And at the same time, right now in US fintech, $63 billion was invested in fintech last year. There is a massive reimagining and digitization of our financial services system that's happening whether we like it or not. And so that's all to say, through investors' eyes, there are a massive opportunity both for commercial return and for direct impact within the world of fintech. And I'm happy to dive into some of the solutions we see that we're excited about.
Well, maybe we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Don, maybe we'll turn to you. Can you talk a little bit about what you're up to at Lafayette Square and some of the sort of impact that you're trying to make?
Yeah, sure thing. And I'll probably, kind of start a little bit at the beginning. And I really appreciate the lead up in terms of the previous panel being made up of solution providers. They were way too nice than I'm going to be right now about the issue. So what we are able to see, you look at national data, Department of Labor data, and you disaggregate employee benefit take-up by income, right? And you see huge disparities for the core bread and butter ones like health insurance and retirement, right? So the benefits industrial complex as it exists now does not center or consider really the needs of low and moderate income workers who are really our focus when we think about impact, right? And so when we go into a company, whether or not they're a portfolio company or not, our role is to really think about how are those LMI workers being served or not being served by the way that benefits are delivered, administered, and financed. And so what we see is 2 things. One is you see this big, huge gap when it comes to take-up. So employers literally are spending much more resources on their higher income employees for benefits than they are for their low income employees for benefits, even though we know that that second group needs them much more, right? That's number one. Number 2, there are benefits that low income workers need that are missing from the equation. And we talked about liquid savings, student loan repayment, et cetera. And so what Worker Solutions as a platform seeks to do is identify solution providers that provide solutions for financial security, including debt. And I would say that more than half of our solutions connect to debt in some form or fashion, whether or not it's financial coaching, student loan repayment, small dollar emergency loans, right? So we're looking at some of the big 3, payday, auto title, medical, as well as student debt, and really seeing private credit as a mechanism to reach these workers that public policies so far have failed. We also believe that other investors that have portfolio companies, particularly those with sizable shares of low and moderate income workers, really need to think about worker solutions in terms of solving some of their issues for their portfolio companies as well. And so at the end of the day, we see private credit as an emerging platform to really address many of the issues that we see with regard to household balance sheets.
No, that's great. What are some of the responses you've gotten from other fund managers as you've talked about these solutions with these portfolio companies?
Well, I think one of the things that we are really clear about is that when we think about impact investing, it's about driving capital to where it's needed the most, so low and moderate income areas, delivering these solutions, and actually being a lender that actually cares about the employees. When you talk to the owners of these businesses, and we tend to focus on owners, families, and entrepreneurs, right? So what you find is that they are trying everything in their disposal to really help out their employees. Many of them, and we specialize in the middle market, right, which is about 300,000 companies, 50 million workers. Many of them have understaffed HR functions. And so in many ways, we are kind of filling a little bit of a gap to really kind of help them identify the right solutions, but also doing analysis on their workforce and benefits uptake that they've actually never done before. And so when we think about ESG, this is our S. When we think about DEI, this is what we consider to be a very important E part of the story, is something that you can actually measure in terms of household balance sheets, whether or not it's savings, credit, or debt. Investors, other folks are really looking for something that they can measure around DEI and ESG.
Well, that's great. Wally, let's turn to you. Could you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, specifically as it relates to cities and city governments?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge opportunity with employers and businesses and that you've talked about and that we've had the benefit of hearing from earlier are leaning into that. But we've also recognized that there are large numbers of people who may not be in the traditional framework of what I'll call a W-2 situation. And so to the extent that we've really tried to reimagine the idea of how you get to large numbers of people at scale, because I think from an investor perspective, the key is like, okay, great. In the world of the Chimes of the world and the Varos of the world and the Aspirations of the world kind of doesn't need another neobank, right? That's going to go on Google AdWords and pay for Facebook. And that's a very expensive channel, and it's hard to get to the individuals that you want to serve. So we sort of said, where is the opportunity to find and help move people forward as well as make the infrastructure more efficient? And we realized it was cities. And it actually became quite apparent during the pandemic, where you had large amounts of capital being allocated to the most vulnerable amongst us, and those most vulnerable amongst us were the last to get the cash, whether you were a small business, whether you were an individual. And that just it highlighted the fact that the system is broken, right? And vis-a-vis people who may not have bank accounts. I mean, it's hard to fathom that 55% of African Americans and 50% of Latinx Americans, if you look at unbanked, underbanked, and other, I like big numbers, that number is 55% of people who are not a part of the financial services system fully. So anyway, so we said, hey, what if we're able to help cities, counties, states, the federal government become much more efficient in terms of getting dollars to people? And that in and of itself is a great business. And so I spent many years at JP Morgan running Treasury Services, and I think of money movement solutions as sort of paint colors. If you give them to my kid, they're going to make a hand turkey. You give them to Michelangelo, they're going to create something that will last generations. And if you can bring tools to municipalities, to government, to help them serve folks who traditionally have fallen in the unbanked and underbanked category, you got a business there, right? And we saw Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles a couple years ago said, I would like to create contactless government. How do I enable individuals to have single sign-on for city services? How do I have a way for people to receive cash electronically as well as pay electronically for city services? And How do you do that in a city where there are 500,000 people who do not have bank accounts and 20% of the neighborhoods do not have a bank branch? So we took our platform and said, we're the right solution for you. And in doing so, we now have created the pipes for cash to move freely with very little friction to every resident in that community. And we've created sort of a wheel so we can go in different cities and say, hey, have you thought about issues like transportation? Have you thought about issues around the arts and getting dollars to the arts? So there's a huge amount of money, $750 billion. And so you talk about a big market. That's a big market that's coming, that's in cash dollars that are moving to individuals from the federal government, state government, and city government, where we have a great opportunity. And the wonderful byproduct of that is individuals who are able to help receive access to benefits and dollars and services probably are the same customer that need high quality, low cost banking products. So that's our model. We think it's very unique. I want all of you to continue to go after the employer sector so we can just hang out in cities and states. But you know, it's a great opportunity. And just one piece, first of all, I love the Urban Institute. Love them. There's one statistic which I think is really interesting that you came up with. I don't know if it was your statistic or not, but 21% of African Americans have a credit score greater than 700, compared to 50% of their white counterparts. Now, I have friends from all backgrounds. I know that my black friend counterparts are not, 50+% less creditworthy than their my white friends, right? We have a structural problem vis-a-vis how you think about evaluating people from a risk perspective. And so we got to address that. That's point one. Another point, I want to take you back not just to 1963, but to 1865. There is an analysis that says that African Americans have the same amount of wealth in 2020 as they did in 1865 when Lincoln freed the slaves. So we have a structural issue in this country vis-a-vis how to think about wealth. And you're an economist, I'm like a amateur historian. And so we have to really reimagine. And I do think from a capital allocation perspective, no disrespect to investors, there's a pattern matching that goes on. And I think that it's hard for investors to see ways to address this economic inequality because companies like we just saw in the previous panel, we're in our nascent stage and there's not enough empirical data for investors to say, okay, I've seen this movie before. And so these different companies have been successful, addressed the problem, so I can rinse and repeat. And I haven't seen a lot of diverse founders with financial services backgrounds who've been able to do this successfully. So my ask of the investment community is to rewire the framework in terms of making investments in early stage companies that come, because starting early stage companies to solve these problems is not like creating a photo sharing app. Like you have to have sat in rooms like this or in ivory towers on Wall Street or in places in Midtown where the financial services companies have migrated to have the apprenticeship. It's not that we're smarter than anybody else. We've just been exposed to different financial scenarios. So put some of the capital behind diverse founders, male, female, black, brown, and whatever, because that's where the innovation is going to come from. Because part of the reason I left, and I'll stop talking, but part of the reason I left JP Morgan, which is a great institution, terrific people, is because I was sitting in rooms like this on a regular basis where we could talk about the issues very articulately and thoughtfully with a lot of data. And I was like, great, I'm gonna go over there and try to solve the problem. And I'd rather try and fail than to be in more rooms like this because we need both. So I love for the capital markets, even when the knives are falling and the market's dropped another couple hundred points today, to continue to invest in diverse founders, because it's only that cohort of people they're going to solve a problem that's at least 150 years old.
Yeah, thank you for that. it kind of hits on this. It kind of hits on this idea of there being, at times, a tension between the impact-related work of a firm like yours or a lender to low and moderate income borrowers and the providers of capital to that firm. Sarah, maybe you could kind of touch on that as you're looking at potential new investments and thinking about companies in the portfolio and the impact goals that they have and how you think about that in alignment with some of the bigger goals that you described.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on that. I think one is we don't fundamentally see them in competition with one another. It goes back to the initial comment, which is this is a huge market and it's a very poorly served market, and you can use technology to give people better products without ripping them off. So that's an achievable goal. In terms of where we see the greatest opportunity to sort of change both the cost and the trust equation, it does often start with massively reducing the cost to serve, finding really interesting distribution channels. Because if you're able to acquire customers at a far lower cost, then you can establish a revenue model that provides value, clarity, and transparency. I'm charging you X, you know you're getting 3X from me. That's important because there's a long history in banking of not delivering on that. And it's part of what I think leads to mistrust amongst consumers. You're ripping me off. It's gotcha fees, it's endless stuff I didn't see coming. And so those elements we really have to design more effectively. I do also think we live in a rapidly digitizing world, and there are a lot of new and interesting data points that we can bring into how we understand someone's risk profile that just weren't available to us 10 years ago. We have credit markets that still very much rely on credit bureau data that's backward-looking and that is outdated. And I think we increasingly have confidence that, for example, cash flow-based underwriting, where you're looking into someone's checking account, is much more timely, it's much more detailed, it is predictive, it is additive, and it's inclusive. All the pieces we need to ask ourselves, right? Because we don't want to start grabbing at data without thinking through, is there disparate impact here? Is this just a proxy for some demographic group? And we are seeing really interesting innovation with folks leveraging cash flow-based underwriting, with new on-ramps to credit building, right? So how do I go from being credit invisible to being seen by the system? We have this really screwed up system where you have to take out debt in order to get debt, and you're just caught, right? And so I think there are very promising new on-ramps, whether it's a SUSU that's taking rent payment data, right? You're paying your rent every month. That tells us something about whether you're creditworthy that hasn't historically been incorporated into the system. Folks like Perch that are using Netflix data. So across data and new channels and better UX, there's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy. Where do you see philanthropy being involved in some of this work? Sigrid, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I've seen very powerful roles of philanthropy, and I'm glad you asked about philanthropy. I know we're going to talk about government too, because I think often philanthropy comes before government. They're the ones taking the risk, piloting, funding that research, building that evidence so that the government then can come in and scale. And when I think of philanthropy, I think about often Don Baylor and the Southern Partnership to Reduce Debt that you founded, which was really powerful. And that brings together, funders can create an ecosystem, a community. And the Southern Partnership to Reduce Debt, there's both national and state grantees. And there's flexible funding then as part of it. And it enables, some of the goals are to enact state and local policies that protect from wealth stripping, to develop innovative and scalable models to prevent and eliminate debt. And when I think about some of the successes and some of the big impacts there, I think about Young Invincibles on the ground in Texas, who then used some of that Urban Institute credit report data that you were referring to. We gave it to them by legislative district in Texas. They had an advocate go up to a legislator where they were at that point pulling professional certifications. If you had student loan debt, for your certification that you hadn't paid, they were pulling your certification, which then made it pretty hard to earn money and pay off that debt. So they went to a legislator and said, this is a problem. And he's like, no, that's not a problem in my district. Like, yes, sir, it is. This % of people in your district. And so then it was passed in Texas, and that helped that many more people that were in trouble. I think philanthropic funding, it can come before the government, but can also be a complement to government funding. And there I'm thinking again of another example where the government paid for really deep research into the effect of asset limits in means-tested programs. So those can be savings penalties, right? We're asking people to encourage them to save, but at the same time we're saying, but if you do, we're gonna cut off these other sources of income. So there are these savings penalties. And we did really deep research that found that when states eased asset limits, people were more likely to have bank accounts, and just like you mentioned, who got the cash last that needed the most, right? Those people, all of a sudden not having a bank account was hugely important again, like it always has been, but it was in the news again. So those asset limits, when they were eased, people are more likely to have bank accounts, they're more likely to have $500 in them. And so that was a little bit buried in a very detailed report where we really couldn't talk about policy. And so we leveraged flexible funding, in this case too from the Annie Casey Foundation, and we lifted up that evidence in a fact sheet called Unintended Consequences. This is what's happening. And then a few years later, Michigan used that evidence and changed across 3 of their major programs, lifted their asset limits to $10,000, made them consistent across the programs. So it was just I think a good example of deep research and then flexible philanthropic funding. I'm going to say one challenge with philanthropic funding too is that it's often not sustainable for programs in the long term, and it can't be counted on. And so you don't want to set up a program to count on it in that way. And there I'm thinking again about, I mentioned the Federal Assets for Independence Act that really helps scale matched savings programs. As part of that, nonprofits had to come up with part of the match themselves from the philanthropic community, and then the government provided the other part. But this became difficult when philanthropy had moved on from match savings accounts to the next hot topic. Then the nonprofits could no longer make that match and cause some difficulty.
We've got just a few minutes left here. I'd love to hear from all of you. I'm an optimist. I'd love to hear what's something that gives you hope, something that gives you reason for optimism about this work and everything we've talked about and the things that you do on a day-to-day. Willie, maybe we'll start with you.
So I guess I'm most optimistic about sort of the presence of people in this room and the level of entrepreneurs that are here and that are not physically in the room, but are in this country thinking about these issues. The folks at Isuzu, the folks that, in terms of the work that's being done, because we need the innovators, right? And so that's a check. You need the people who can do the work, and we need more people. And I think this whole movement of DEI that's been around for a long time, quite frankly, it's just got a laser focus on it, will enable more people and within organizations to become the future entrepreneurs. We really got to double down on that. And I'm also encouraged by the fact that capital allocators, and I actually think of philanthropy as the tax-deductible way that you can put dollars to work, as opposed to the after-tax dollars that come from allocators from Flourish and others. But there's a recognition that these are important issues and are willing to put real dollars behind it. And I think you got people who've got great ideas with people who've got significant capital. We can make a real difference in terms of solving these problems.
Great. Sarah?
Maybe 2. 1, I do think we're making modest progress on overdraft fees. Those have historically been $10 to $15 billion a year. And between a new generation of challenger banks like the Chimes and the Aspirations coupled with policy pressure, it's been really heartening to see the industry start to move. And so it's welcomed announcements from Capital One and Ally alike in terms of rethinking their policies there. I do think this disaggregation of data by race is really important, and it does trickle into the startup community more slowly than we'd like. But when I see pitch decks, when founders come to me, this data eventually becomes part of their market problem slides. And we didn't have this 5 years ago. It was abundantly obvious that this was an issue. But it's just to say, I do think bringing light to this data trickles into startups and hopefully will make people realize, man, that is a huge problem. And I can be a part of building for that and making it better.
Yeah, so one of the philanthropic investments that probably most proud of is the Debt in America piece, which sits on Urban Institute's platform. And with that, what we sought to do was disaggregate the data by place. And you start to see really weird things when you do that, right? You see that a person in Louisiana is about 9-10 times more likely to be in medical debt than a person that lives in Minnesota, right? So you're asking these questions like, well, are these people like that bad? Are they that uncredit worthy? No, I mean, this is about public policy, the history of, Jim Crow segregation, on and on and on. And so I think what we're most hopeful about, at Lafayette Square is being a place-based investor. When we make an extension of credit to a company, we consider where they are. If they're in South Carolina, they're much more subject to payday lending than if they're in Minnesota, for example. And so really having that lens, both with portfolio companies as well as investors, is a way to galvanize change as well.
And I'll say I think our country's focus on racial justice and economic security really gives an opportunity to change this wealth building trajectory. I said Connecticut and District of Columbia passed baby bonds legislation. 7 other states are looking at it right now, and they're all in a learning community together to support one another. Some states have supported wealth building by addressing some of the systemic racism, by easing asset limits, by expanding Medicaid to help with that medical debt and collection and some of those big disparities. 12 states haven't, and many of those are in the South. And then change makers are understanding that both income and assets and wealth are needed. And there again, I'm going to use DC as an example, that in DC's 2022 budget, they included funding for guaranteed income pilot programs, so tackling that income side of this, the expansion of the DC federal earned income tax match, so again, a little bit more on that cash side, and then baby bonds. And then they already had a match savings account program before, so really a suite of policies that I think can make a difference.
Great. I just want to say thank you to the Aspen Institute and the St. Louis Fed and the New York Fed's community development team, Devon in particular, for getting this all organized today, and thank you to the panel for participating. Thank you.
Ray and I have been basically delegated to be sitting here listening. And now we're going to give both technical feedback and real feedback to the room. Yeah, so that's our goal. I think part of my actual bio is that I like to connect idiosyncratic dots. So Ray's going to give you a very clear 1, 2, 3 thematic. I know you are, because you're so good at it. You've got 5 and 5. Yeah. I'm going to give you a sense of the headlines that are sticking with me that I haven't quite built out yet. But thinking about the 3 panels, the 4 panels, and the deep work that we've been thinking about as we're imagining both the need and the opportunity in this country at this time to make sure that the issue of wealth inequality stays sticky, becomes more actionable, and brings in a lot more leaders who see it as part of their role as leaders to address this issue. That we start to produce this issue with the kind of toeholds that people need to start to really tackle this and not let go. I think one of the most constructive pieces of that is to turn this on its head and start to talk more about the issue of addressing wealth inequality like we have started talking about the issue of addressing climate change. You don't hear anybody anymore talk about climate change in fuzzy ways. Have the emissions in 30 years. People have targets. People have accountability. People have found a way to mobilize capital markets. We are not there. We need to get there quickly. One of our ways of thinking about that you'll start to hear more and more about is we need to 10x the wealth of the bottom 50% in 20 years. That is ambitious, that is accountable, that has measures, and to Signa Mary's point, we will need solutions that can scale. We'll need the philanthropic and government and private sector capital that can do that. We'll need the innovators, and we'll need to get on board real quick with each other. So here are my top line takeaways from today. If we're going to do any of that, the conversation about the future of wealth really has to be anchored in a conversation about the legacy of debt in this country. And the first thing that I think we really heard about today that is part of the narrative change we need is that credit and debt are not two sides of the same coin. That depends on who you are, where you live. Much of the work we've done at Aspen on debt is that, and a lot of it isn't available in the data yet. A lot of what people experience as debt is before they ever have access to credit. Medical debt, unpaid bills. These things don't show up in the survey of consumer finances on a balance sheet in terms of a debt that is connected to an asset. This is we don't want to talk about good and bad debt, but I do want to think about functional and dysfunctional debt in a person's life. And the difference in my mind, the metaphor I started coming up with as well, early on, if you're looking at the properties of quicksand or cement, they look the same. But pretty quickly, you start to understand that one of those is going to be nothing but problems for you. Another is going to be a very solid foundation for your growth. So we need to start to have a much better ability to diagnose the kind of debt that is going to be quicksand for people, the kind of debt that's going to be a foundation for growth. The second part of that is that form follows function. The other reason that credit and debt are not the same sides of the same coin is that every problem we are solving in this country with debt is not a problem that should be solved with credit. We had a really interesting conversation yesterday that has become quickly Devon and my favorite new 2x2 matrix in the world, and I want to thank Stephen Nunez here from the Jane Family Institute for bringing it up. There is a really interesting way that we can start to array the kinds of risks that households are grappling with and trying to manage on their own with private market solutions versus what is the role of government. Low cost, low probability emergencies in people's houses, low cost, high probability, low cost, high probability, and high cost, high probability types of issues. But we know that people are using debt to manage and produce routinely positive cash flow. Not a great idea, right? When you're taking out a loan to pay for your daycare, quicksand. Emergency savings, great for high probability, low cost events. Credit, personal credit, really good for certain kinds of things. But when we start to think about other things, let's use the whole toolbox. Form follows function. What's the role of insurance? How are we innovating on social insurance? How are we innovating on private sector insurance? How are we helping families manage financial shocks that are above what they should be self-insuring for? Let's make sure, as we're understanding Signa Mary's call for research, that we are really thinking about the proper diagnostics of why debt is occurring in somebody's life and what the solution set needs to be for that. And the final piece of that I would say is that those two kind of thoughts in my head go to both the policy and market innovators. We had a lot of the entrepreneurs here in the room today that are really using data, using technology, using their deep lived experience in communities that are highly vulnerable to fix things. We need the same kind of innovators on the policy side, and we need cross-cutting conversations, because what we had to do with policy back in the age of avocado appliances and shag carpeting, we can solve some of those problems with technology diagnostics now, and policy can shape a new role. So I think that calling for that modernization across policy and market and thinking about those in the same room together is a critical part of putting this on the to-do list for all of us together. And I'll turn it over to you from there.
Thank you, Ida. You're always so thoughtful, even without a lot of preparation. I'm always love listening to you. Whether you prepare or not, you're thoughtful. Sorry if that didn't come out quite right. It was meant to be a compliment. Always thoughtful. So it's great to be here. I would love to comment on every one of the contributors and innovators that was up here today. I learned a lot. I wrote down everything. In the limited time we have, I'm going to do as Ida predicted, put things into little categories. I have 5 sort of takeaways, things that struck me personally, and then 5 brief thoughts connecting to some other work we're doing at the St. Louis Fed. So on the takeaways, Lynette's comment about the black tax, so powerful, so real. Our own research corroborated that very idea, showing that it is in fact a contributor to lower wealth levels among people of color. So I think that deserves a lot of consideration. Fred's comment about don't define us by our gaps, our deficits, was really powerful too. And we tend to do that. And it's not right, it's not the right framing, and I hope we all learn from that. I really appreciate that. Sid mentioned, where is Sid? Oh, there you are, thank you. A couple of things struck me. I mean, this idea that we should take life events, one life event at a time, and try to get that right, I thought was very powerful rather than trying to do everything. And also, I particularly loved your idea, this is number 4, of not having new solutions, to not use the old buckets for the new solutions. I mean, I thought that was so powerful. I'm very involved in baby bonds, 529s around the country, and your thought made me think, my gosh, are we slotting this big idea into sort of old platforms and old solutions? So I thought that's an idea that should apply for all of our work, and some of the best innovators in the country were featured today, and I was really struck by that. And then Wole and many others, too many to name, Signa Mary, made really critical comments about infrastructure and institutions, and that these are institutional failures that have led to racial, generational, educational, and gender wealth gaps. And that we tend to focus too much on individual behavior and not enough on institutional behavior. We need to get institutions to behave better so that poor people have, or low-income people, or whomever. It's not just about making better choices. It's about having better choices to make. Okay. Finally, I'm getting the sign here, but I'm going to try to wrap up quickly. Just 5 things that connect to some other work we're doing at the Fed. I've been involved in policy efforts for 30 years. I've learned that sometimes policies move forward because of the evidence, indifferent to the evidence, and despite the evidence. And that doesn't mean that we don't put our heads down and generate great evidence, and it should matter to get a policy and to get it right. But policy making is about values, it's about timing, and we have to be ready for that and play that game too. Talk about narratives and things like that. Secondly, previous work that we did, including our Tipping Points Debt Research Symposium, found that a critical fault line in the debt world is between secured and unsecured debt, and that you tend to have better outcomes, even among lower income people with secured debt, than you do with unsecured debt. So I think that fault line really does matter. Third, I think building on a lot of the great work that Aspen has done is that, emergency savings lets us avoid debt in the first place. And one of the innovations that I'm most excited about is getting this intersection between the long-term and the short-term right. So it started off in the retirement savings world, where we added an emergency savings bucket. There's experimentation, some policy innovation there. That's great. It's now worked its way into the 529 intersection between emergency savings and 529s. And there's examples of mortgage products that add an escrow account for emergency savings into the mortgage. So I think a real frontier is getting the balance between the short and the long-term right, and sort of building that into the products is really, I think, exciting. And finally, wealth protection. We've done a lot of work on accumulating wealth, trying to not to remove the barriers, as Signa Mary talked about. I think we need to do more on the protection front. And just a shout out to an essay that Ida and I have in the book on family wealth insurance. We pull for the risk of losing your income. We don't pull for the risk of losing your wealth. And I think that would be a valuable contribution, and I hope we can talk more about that. I'm sorry for going over, but thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Ida. Hi, everyone. My name is Devon Bodie. I'm at the Community Development Unit here at the New York Fed, and I am here to close us out. It's been such a great day. We've heard from a lot of speakers. I really wanted to just take this time for us to give a round of applause for all the speakers we heard from today. Thank you. And I also wanted to thank, of course, the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, St. Louis Fed, the Institute of Economic Equity. Here at the New York Fed and the Community Development Unit, we've been going deep into 3 different issue areas. That is household financial well-being, the social determinants of health, and then lastly, climate adaptation and resiliency. And going into these topics, it allows us to have conversations just like the one that we had today. It allows us to invite actors from industries, many different industries, into one room to really understand the nuances of many different issues and subjects, such as household debt. And lastly, it allows us to uplift transformative solutions that can really go the distance in changing the lives of people who really need the most help. So I think that is what's most important to me and to a lot of you who are sitting here and listening in virtually as well. So with that, I would like to just again thank you all for attending this event. We invite you back to attend our future events, both virtual and in person. And everyone who is here in person, we invite you to join our reception after this. So please stay and talk to the speakers, talk to us, and we look forward to more conversations. So yeah, with that, we're closed. Thank you.